Okay, we're here at the old plantation house for Colonel John Marshall and later Benjamin Hale, the discoverer of gold in this area, largest gold mine east of the Mississippi. And we're right on the banks of the Little Lynches River, which continues down near the site of the Rev War reenactment at Gates Ford, where General Gates crossed with his troops on the way to the Battle of Camden. We may be about 3 miles from the site of the this year's reenactment. Well, this house, which when I was a kid was called Kirkwood for the third family that had owned the estate, the Kirkleys, has only ever been in 3 families until past the middle of the 20th century. Colonel Marshall, the Hales, who also discovered gold in Lancaster County, just up the road. And when they did, they moved to Camden. But the Kirkleys had bought some of the land in 1804. And in 1858, they bought a bunch from my aunt, the widow Hale, who was about to move to Florida. And so from that time, 1858, they pretty much owned all of this plantation. You know, if you had come here 250 years ago, you would have found the seat of maybe the principal magnate of this section. His name was John Marshall. He'd been here about 10 years, and he had come at a time when there was no law and order at all. He became one of the regulators in the late 1760s. But by 1775, he was one of 4 men from the newly formed Camden district who went to the provincial assembly in Charleston. And to show you his stature at that time, the other 3 were Thomas Sumter and Joseph and Ely Kershaw. So it's amazing that he's been forgotten to the degree that he has. He became a captain in the Patriot forces by 1778, the same rank held by John Chestnut, and quickly moved up to major and then colonel. He was in several important battles, Hanging Rock, Utah Springs, Fishing Creek. At one time, before the Battle of Hanging Rock, the British actually camped on these grounds around his house, and the Americans did after the victory. So this very place where we are was a campground for both sides of the armies in that conflict. After the war, Colonel Marshall became a justice of the peace, and in 1783 he was appointed to head one of 10 districts in the state for confiscating Tory property. And he was so good at it, he'd been the scourge of the Tories during the war, that his was the 4th largest, even though this was still backcountry in 1783. He got 689 people rounded up and confiscated their lands. Most of them, of course, were in the West Indies or Canada or back in England. But he was a very effective man and a very important man in the area. In fact, the state of South Carolina, you probably know, gave General Thomas Sumter just tons of land because they didn't have the money to pay him for his services in the Revolution. And my own ancestor, Robert Gardner, bought some of that land from him up on Flat Creek. But they gave also Colonel Marshall 35,000 acres of land, and a lot of it was in Lancaster, Chesterfield counties, which is not far from here. We're right on Little Lynches, by the way, where Colonel Marshall had a mill. And he was a great gentleman in the area. Francis Asbury, who was one of the first 2 Methodist bishops in this country, was entertained here and preached here to a large gathering. This was in 1789. In 1790, Colonel Marshall was a delegate to Charleston for the Constitutional Convention for the state. So he was pretty old by that time, around 60 years old. And so he was sort of like Dr. Franklin in Philadelphia, one of the senior people. He died in 1793, And by that time, he had been so far forgotten that there's not even a mention in the Charleston papers about his passing that I've found. His estate was in probate for many years. The principal beneficiary was Benjamin Hale Sr., who he had known in Edgecombe County, North Carolina before moving here, and who was a captain under him in the Revolution. He got all of these lands for practically a song, which makes me wonder if there wasn't some tie of kinship between them as well. There's no record of Marshall's having a wife and children, although in 1790, when the first census was taken, there were 42 people living here, 36 of them enslaved. And I'm thinking, since his nephew was one of his executors, it may have been the nephew and his wife and children who were living here with John Marshall.